Jesus had sisters. If you're scratching your head right now, you're not alone. While we know plenty about his brothers, James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas, and celebrate his mother Mary, his sisters have been reduced to a single verse that most people skip right over. But what if I told you that these forgotten women may have played crucial roles in the early Christian movement that we're only now beginning to understand? Today, we're diving deep into the hidden stories of Jesus' sisters, the women the Bible barely mentions, but who might have been instrumental in shaping Christianity as we know it. Though before we dive in, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Please say hello in the comments. Let us know where you're watching from and what time it is. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you for joining me today. So without further ado, let's begin. The Anonymous Sisters, an introduction to the family's hidden women. Nazareth was a small hill village in Galilee, unremarkable, ordinary, and home to a family whose story would reshape history. Scripture names the sons James, Joses, Simon, and Judas. We know Mary, we know Joseph. But hidden inside two brief verses lies a final category the Gospels almost whisper. Jesus had sisters. Mark records the crowd asking, "Are not his sisters here with us?" Matthew echoes the line. That's it. No names, no details, just the acknowledgement that these women existed, living, working, and growing up alongside the most influential figure in human history. Their anonymity isn't an accident. In the ancient world, women's stories were rarely preserved. Most were recorded only as someone's daughter, someone's wife, someone's mother. The sisters of Jesus become symbols of this silence, representatives of countless women whose lives shaped their communities but were never written into the record. So what can we know? The plural sisters suggests at least two, possibly more. But numbers matter less than context. First-century Jewish daughters were raised for marriage and household leadership. Their education centered on domestic skills, not literacy. Their world was bounded by village life, ritual obligations, and the demands of agricultural seasons. When Jesus began his ministry, claiming authority that shocked his hometown, these sisters would have felt the tension between family loyalty and public pressure. Mark even describes the family attempting to restrain Jesus, thinking he had lost his senses. The sisters aren't named in this scene, but their omission doesn't imply absence, only that the narrative doesn't follow them. To understand them, we read the shadows. They appear in the background of questions neighbors asked. They are implied in the household dynamics the Gospels assume but don't spell out. Their silence reflects the larger pattern of history. Women present, influential, essential, and almost always unnamed. Yet these sisters matter. They remind us that Jesus grew up in a real home with real siblings, people who shared chores, frustrations, memories, and a family identity long before the crowds gathered. They represent the unseen majority, those whose lives supported the foundations of early Christianity without ever entering the spotlight. We cannot recover their names or personalities, but we can reconstruct the world they lived in, the pressures they faced, and the social structures that shaped their lives. By doing so, we honor not only these forgotten women, but every woman whose story was lost to time simply because no one wrote it down. Reading the silences, the biblical and historical context of the sisters. The evidence for Jesus' sisters appears in two primary passages, both recording the same event. When Jesus returned to Nazareth to teach in the synagogue, his neighbors reacted with astonishment and skepticism. Mark records their response. "Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary and brother of James and Joses and Judas and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us?" Matthew's version is similar. "Is not this the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary? And are not his brothers James and Joseph and Simon and Judas? And are not all his sisters with us?" These verses raise immediate questions. The brothers receive names. 4 are listed, but the sisters remain anonymous, identified only through their relationship to the family and their continued presence in Nazareth. The phrase, "Are they not all with us?" suggests the sisters were still living in the village, likely married to local men, integrated into the community in ways that Jesus and his brothers were not. This detail tells us something significant. While the brothers eventually became mobile, traveling with or following Jesus' movement, the sisters remained rooted in place. The Greek word used for sisters is adelphoi, the feminine plural of adelphos, meaning sibling from the same womb. Some traditions argue these were cousins or step-siblings from a previous marriage of Joseph, positions taken primarily to defend the doctrine of Mary's perpetual virginity. However, the most straightforward reading of the text and the position held by many Protestant scholars interprets these as literal siblings, children born to Mary and Joseph after Jesus. The anonymity of the sisters fits a broader pattern in ancient literature. Women were rarely named unless they held unusual prominence. Throughout the Gospels, women appear as healed persons, as followers who supported Jesus' ministry, as witnesses to the crucifixion and resurrection. Many remain unnamed. The woman with the hemorrhage, the Syrophoenician woman, the widow with her 2 coins, all these figures exist in the narrative without personal names. This was not unique to Christian texts. Ancient Jewish, Greek, and Roman literature all tended to omit women's names unless the woman was royalty, extremely wealthy, or involved in scandal. The social structure of first-century Jewish communities placed women under the authority of fathers and then husbands. A woman's identity was derived from her relationships to men. She was someone's daughter, someone's wife, someone's mother. Independent legal identity was limited. Women could not testify in court. They were not required to attend synagogue, though many did. They were excluded from much of public religious life, unable to read Torah publicly or be counted in the minyan, the quorum needed for prayer. This context helps explain why the sisters' names were never recorded. They did not travel with Jesus. They did not become leaders in the early church. They remained in Nazareth, fulfilling traditional roles. Therefore, whoever compiled the gospel accounts saw no reason to preserve their individual identities. The brothers, by contrast, became significant figures. James led the Jerusalem church. Jude may have written an epistle. Their names mattered for ecclesiastical history. The sisters, confined to domestic spheres, simply did not register as historically important to the early Christian chroniclers. Yet their presence in these passages serves a rhetorical purpose. When the people of Nazareth list Jesus' family members, they do so to emphasize his ordinariness. They are saying, "We know this man. We know his family. His mother lives among us. His siblings are our neighbors. What gives him the right to speak with such authority?" The mention of the sisters, though brief and anonymous, contributes to this argument. Their very familiarity becomes evidence against Jesus' claims to special knowledge or divine mission. Archaeological evidence from first-century Galilee helps us understand the world these sisters inhabited. Excavations at sites like Capernaum, Nazareth, and surrounding villages reveal modest dwellings, typically single-room houses made of stone and mud brick with thatched or dirt roofs. Extended families often lived in compounds clustered around shared courtyards. Households were multi-generational, with married sons sometimes bringing wives to live within the family complex. Daughters, however, typically left upon marriage to join their husband's family. The economy of Galilee was primarily agricultural, supplemented by fishing near the lake and some craft production. Most families lived at subsistence level, producing just enough for their own needs with little surplus. Women's labor was essential to household survival. They ground grain, baked bread, drew water, made and mended clothing, preserved food, and managed countless other tasks that sustained daily life. This labor was invisible in historical records, but absolutely central to family survival. Religious life structured the rhythm of days and seasons. The Sabbath provided a weekly pause from labor, a time for synagogue gathering and family meals. Major festivals like Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles marked the year. Purity laws governed many aspects of daily life, particularly for women, whose monthly cycles required ritual immersion in a mikveh before they could participate in certain religious activities. These regulations were not seen as oppressive by most who observed them, but as part of covenant faithfulness, ways of marking Jewish identity in a world dominated by Roman power. Into this world, Jesus' sisters were born. They learned from their mother. They helped with household tasks from early childhood. They absorbed the stories of their people, the Exodus narrative, the giving of Torah, the reigns of David and Solomon, the words of the prophets. They celebrated festivals, observed dietary laws, and lived within the social boundaries that defined proper behavior for Jewish women in Galilee. When their brother began to attract attention through his teaching and reported healings, These boundaries would be tested in ways none of them could have anticipated. The silence surrounding the sisters is not merely an absence, it is itself a historical fact that requires interpretation. Why were they not named? Because women of their social position were not typically named. Why did they apparently not travel with Jesus? Because respectable women did not travel without male protection, and married women were expected to remain with their husbands. Why do they disappear from the narrative after these early mentions? Because the gospel writers focused on those who became public figures in the movement, and the sisters, by all available evidence, did not. Yet this disappearance does not mean they ceased to matter. It means only that our sources do not follow them. The text tells us they existed, that they were known in Nazareth, that they continued living in the village while their brothers scattered. Beyond that, we must rely on historical reconstruction, on understanding the patterns and possibilities of women's lives in that time and place. The silences can be read, the absences can be interpreted, and in doing so, we recover something of the lives of women who were never meant to be forgotten, but simply were never recorded in the first place. Daughters of Nazareth, reconstructing a Galilean girlhood. Life in Nazareth began before sunrise. For the daughters of Joseph and Mary, childhood meant work, grinding grain, tending fires, drawing water, and helping manage a household where every task mattered. Archaeology paints the scene. A village of a few hundred people, stone houses packed together, families living in close quarters. The sisters of Jesus would have grown up in one of these small homes, sharing space with siblings, animals, and constant activity. Girls in Galilee learned by imitation, not schooling. Literacy was rare, and formal education focused on boys. Daughters were trained in the practical skills that kept a family alive, grinding flour for hours each day, hauling water from the village well, spinning thread, weaving cloth, mending garments, and preparing the simple foods that sustained rural life. Nothing was wasted. Every loaf of bread and every garment represented hours of unseen labor. As they grew older, the sisters took on more responsibility, caring for younger siblings, managing household tasks, and preparing for an early marriage arranged within the community. Childhood blended into adulthood without ceremony. Puberty meant readiness for betrothal, and with it, a new set of expectations. Alongside domestic training, they absorbed the stories of Israel's women, Sarah, Rachel, Ruth, Deborah, through prayer, song, and festival traditions learned by participation rather than instruction. Religion framed their world. Purity laws shaped daily routines, and festivals demanded extensive preparation. They learned the rhythms of Jewish life, lighting Sabbath lamps, keeping dietary regulations, reciting prayers, and maintaining the rituals that connected their small village to the larger story of God's people. Roman rule was an ever-present reality, but daily life continued. Children played, neighbors talked, women worked, and families tried to survive under taxation and political tension. Into this environment, Jesus grew and changed. At first, his curiosity about Scripture may have seemed unremarkable. Pious young men sometimes pursued deeper study. But when he stepped into public ministry, speaking with authority he had never formally earned, the shift would have been jarring. Nazareth was small, reputation mattered. A brother viewed as delusional or disruptive threatened the entire household's standing. For unmarried sisters, this could directly affect marriage prospects and social acceptance. Yet the sisters stayed. They did not follow him, as some brothers eventually did. Whether by custom, obligation, or simply the limits placed on women's mobility, they remained rooted in Nazareth while the movement around Jesus grew. Respectable women did not roam freely. Travel required male protection and permission. Their lives were tied to home, marriage, and community expectations. Their work left no written record. Their voices were not preserved. But they were present, shaping the household Jesus grew up in, observing the early stirrings of a ministry that would later shake empires. They knew him before the crowds, before the miracles, before the crucifixion. In their silence, we glimpse the countless unnamed women whose lives sustained families, communities, and movements, even when history chose not to remember them, through a sister's eyes, witnessing a brother's controversial ministry. The day Jesus returned to Nazareth and taught in the synagogue, the sisters would have been present, standing in the women's section, listening to their brother speak with an authority that seemed to come from nowhere they recognized. The people around them whispered, shocked and offended. Who did he think he was? They had watched him grow up. They knew him. This carpenter's son, this ordinary man from an ordinary family, had no right to speak as though he possessed special knowledge. The sisters must have felt this tension acutely. Family loyalty would pull them one direction. Social pressure would push them another. In a small village like Nazareth, deviation from accepted norms brought swift social consequences. Women, particularly unmarried women, were especially vulnerable to community judgment. If their brother was seen as a troublemaker, a false teacher, someone who had abandoned proper respect for established religious authorities, this reputation would cling to his family. We know from Mark's gospel that Jesus' family attempted at one point to take him away, believing he had lost his senses. The text specifically mentions his mother and brothers coming to retrieve him. The sisters are not mentioned, but this does not mean they were not involved. They may have been present, standing behind the male relatives who would do the public speaking. They may have sent their brothers to intervene, or they may have remained in Nazareth, torn between hope that Jesus was right and fear that he was heading toward disaster. The ministry Jesus conducted challenged many conventions. He spoke with women publicly, something rabbis typically avoided. He touched people considered ritually impure. He healed on the Sabbath, provoking accusations that he violated the law. He associated with tax collectors and known sinners, people that respectable folk kept at a distance. He told stories that inverted normal expectations, making heroes of Samaritans and praising the faith of Gentiles over the righteousness of Jewish leaders. Each of these actions would have generated gossip, would have reached the sisters through the networks of communication that connected villages across Galilee. How did they process this information? Did they defend their brother when others spoke against him? Did they remain silent, unwilling to draw attention to their connection? Did they believe his claims? These questions have no certain answers, but we can consider what their options would have been, what choices were available to women in their position. If the sisters were married, their husband's opinions would have carried significant weight. A husband might forbid his wife from supporting her controversial brother. He might insist she distance herself from the family to protect their own household's reputation. Women were expected to obey their husbands in such matters. The move from father's household to husband's household meant a shift in primary loyalties. A married daughter belonged more to her new family than to her birth family. If any sisters remained unmarried, they would have been under their father's authority, or after Joseph's death, under their brother James's headship. Their ability to act independently would have been extremely limited. They could not travel alone to seek out Jesus. They could not make public declarations of support without male permission. The most they could do was speak quietly among other women, share their thoughts in private spaces, and pray. Prayer would have been their primary recourse. Jewish women participated fully in prayer life, even if excluded from public reading of Torah. They recited the Shema, the central Jewish prayer affirming God's oneness. They observed the hours of prayer. They lit Sabbath candles and spoke the blessings. In these moments of devotion, the sisters could have brought their confusion and worry directly to God, asking for wisdom, for protection for their brother, for understanding of what was happening to their family. The reports that filtered back to Nazareth would have been mixed. Some said Jesus performed remarkable healings, that blind people received sight, that lame people walked. Others said he cast out demons, that unclean spirits fled at his command. Still others reported his teaching, parables about seeds and soil, about lost things found, about the kingdom of God breaking into the present moment. Each story would have prompted questions. How was he doing these things? Where did this power come from? Was it divine or something darker? The religious authorities began to take notice. Pharisees questioned Jesus. Scribes challenged his interpretations. As opposition grew, the danger increased. The sisters would have sensed this escalation. In their world, crossing powerful people led to serious consequences. The Romans might overlook minor religious teachers, but someone gathering large crowds, someone speaking in ways that could be interpreted as seditious, someone who seemed to be claiming messianic identity. Such a person invited trouble. Fear must have been constant, fear for Jesus' safety, fear for the family's reputation, fear of Roman reprisal, fear of being ostracized by neighbors. The sisters would have carried these anxieties while continuing their daily labor, grinding grain and drawing water and caring for children. There was no pause in domestic responsibilities, no relief from the demands of survival. Worry had to coexist with work. At some point, perhaps gradually, some family members began to believe. James, initially skeptical, eventually became a leader in the Jerusalem church. Paul's letters mention seeing James and refer to him as the Lord's brother. Tradition holds that the risen Jesus appeared to James, and this encounter transformed his understanding. But what about the sisters? Did they undergo similar conversions? Did they come to believe their brother was indeed the Messiah, the one promised by prophets? We have no direct evidence. They do not appear in the resurrection accounts. They are not mentioned among the women who followed Jesus from Galilee and witnessed his crucifixion. They are not listed in Acts among the believers who gathered after the ascension. This absence might mean they never believed. Or it might simply mean that, once again, their presence was not deemed worth recording. The experience of watching a sibling become a controversial religious leader would have been isolating. The sisters could not fully share their perspective with outsiders, who would not understand the complexity of loving someone while questioning their choices. They could not explain to those who never knew Jesus as a child what it felt like to hear him speak with divine authority. The distance between the Jesus they grew up with and the Jesus who gathered crowds and challenged authorities must have seemed impossible to bridge. Yet they remained connected through family bonds. Even if they disagreed, even if they worried, even if they sometimes felt ashamed or confused, they were still his sisters. They still remembered him as a boy. They still carried shared memories of childhood, of family meals, of stories told by their mother, of songs sung at festivals. These connections could not be erased by theological differences or public controversy. Through their eyes, we see Jesus from an angle the Gospels rarely provide. Not as the authoritative teacher, not as the miracle worker, not as the divine son, but as a brother. Someone ordinary made extraordinary by claims and actions that seemed to contradict everything they thought they knew. Someone whose choices affected them whether they agreed or not. Someone they could not simply dismiss but could not easily accept. In their tension, we recognize the challenge faced by many who encounter religious claims that disrupt comfortable categories and demand responses that carry real social costs. At the cross and the empty tomb, the sisters in the Passion narrative. All four Gospels record women at the crucifixion and the empty tomb. Mark names Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, and Salome. Matthew lists Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of Zebedee's sons. John highlights Mary Magdalene, Mary the wife of Clopas, and Jesus' mother. Luke speaks more generally of the women who followed Jesus from Galilee. Notably absent from every list, Jesus' sisters. Yet the repeated phrase, many other women, leaves the door open. The question is not whether the sisters are named. They aren't, but whether they could have been among the unnamed witnesses. Understanding that possibility requires knowing how Passover worked. Men were obligated to make the pilgrimage to Jerusalem, women were not. Many went anyway, but the journey from Galilee was long, physically demanding, and difficult for anyone with small children. Married sisters might have remained home for practical reasons. But news of Jesus' arrest could have pushed them to make the journey regardless. In Jewish family culture, standing with a relative facing death was a serious duty. The women specifically named in the Passion accounts offer clues, but not certainty. Mary Magdalene was a follower, not family. Mary, the mother of James and Joses, could be Jesus' mother, but the connection is debated. Salome appears in Mark, and some older traditions tie her to Jesus' family, though this rests on speculative harmonization of the gospel lists. If the sisters were present, they likely stood with the other women at a distance, watching a brutal Roman execution they were powerless to stop. Crucifixion was meant to humiliate, terrify, and make a public example. For family members, witnessing it would have been almost unbearable. John clearly places Mary, Jesus' mother, at the cross. If Mary was there, it is reasonable, not certain, that she would have sought the company of her daughters. Women mourned together. They supported each other through grief. And no mother watched her child die alone if she had family capable of standing beside her. After Jesus' death, the women followed Joseph of Arimathea to the tomb. They planned to return after the Sabbath to complete burial rites, tasks traditionally handled by women. Early Sunday morning, women again appear as the first witnesses to the empty tomb. Every gospel agrees on this point. Women were first. In a culture that distrusted female testimony, this consistency is difficult to fabricate and strongly supports historical authenticity. Were Jesus' sisters among these women? The text never says. They may have been there. They may have remained in Nazareth. If they did witness the empty tomb, their reaction, faith, shock, fear, or wordless grief, is lost to history. The resurrection appearance lists don't help. Paul mentions appearances to Peter, the 12, more than 500 believers, James, and the apostles, not to the sisters. But Paul's list isn't meant to be exhaustive, only to cite authoritative public witnesses. Private believers, especially women in domestic roles, simply don't appear in the historical spotlight. This silence fits the broader pattern of the Gospels. Women who stepped into public leadership, Mary Magdalene, Priscilla, Phoebe, Junia, enter the record. Women who lived within expected social boundaries, even if profoundly faithful, often disappear from view. If Jesus' sisters traveled to Jerusalem, they would eventually have returned to the routines of Nazareth: children to raise, food to prepare, daily tasks that did not pause even for resurrection. They might have been changed forever by what they saw, or left bewildered, holding more questions than answers. Either way, their lives moved forward quietly, without documentation, like countless women whose quiet faith and presence helped sustain the earliest Christian communities. The other Mary and the Salome, candidates and conjecture. The silence of the Gospels leaves questions hanging in the air. When Mark and Matthew mention the sisters, they offer no names. When John describes women at the cross, he lists them carefully. When women appear at the empty tomb, the lists shift and change. Who were these figures? Over centuries, scholars and theologians have tried to solve the puzzle by looking for the sisters in other passages, searching for clues in parallel accounts, attempting to identify them among the named women who followed Jesus from Galilee to Jerusalem. The most frequent proposal centers on a woman called Mary of Clopas. John places her at the cross alongside Jesus' mother and Mary Magdalene. The passage reads with intriguing ambiguity. It mentions the mother of Jesus, then his mother's sister, then Mary, the wife of Clopas, then Mary Magdalene. Some scholars count 3 women here. Others count 4. The question hinges on punctuation and grammar, on whether his mother's sister stands as a separate person or describes Mary of Clopas herself. Early tradition connects Clopas to Jesus' family through Joseph. Writers from the 2nd century identify Clopas as Joseph's brother. If Mary of Clopas married Joseph's brother, she would be Jesus' aunt by marriage, not by blood. The children of this union would be cousins to Jesus and his siblings. This interpretation gained favor, particularly in the Western Church, where it helped explain away references to Jesus' brothers and sisters by recasting them as cousins rather than siblings. Another woman enters the discussion. Salome appears in Mark's Gospel at the crucifixion and resurrection. She travels with Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, to anoint Jesus' body. Matthew's parallel passage mentions the mother of Zebedee's sons in the same narrative position where Mark places Salome. Most scholars identify these as the same person. Salome, in this reading, was married to Zebedee the fisherman. She was mother to James and John, 2 of the 12 apostles. She was the woman who asked Jesus to let her sons sit at his right and left hand in his kingdom. But could Salome be more than this? Some early sources suggest she was related to Jesus' family. If the unnamed sister mentioned in John is separate from Mary of Clopas, Salome becomes a candidate for this role. The logic follows a certain pattern. Mark names Salome at the cross. John mentions Jesus' mother's sister but gives no name. Matthew refers to the mother of Zebedee's sons. When you align these passages, overlapping the women present at each moment, Salome emerges as a possibility for being Mary's sister and thus Jesus' maternal aunt. This identification carried weight in some traditions. Medieval legends expanded on it, creating elaborate family trees. One popular story claimed that Saint Anne, mother of Mary, had 3 husbands and 3 daughters, all named Mary. In this scheme, Mary Salome was a half-sister to Jesus' mother. She married Zebedee and bore James and John, making them Jesus' cousins. The Council of Trent later rejected this particular tradition as lacking scriptural foundation. Yet the connection between Salome and the Holy Family persisted in art and devotion. The evidence pulls in different directions. On one side, the parallel gospel accounts suggest that certain unnamed women in one gospel might be the named women in another. The lists overlap but don't match precisely. Mary Magdalene appears in every account of the crucifixion and resurrection. Beyond her, the names shift. Mary, mother of James and Joses, appears frequently. Some traditions equate her with Mary of Clopas. Others see her as Jesus' own mother, described by her other sons' names. Salome appears in Mark. The mother of Zebedee's sons appears in Matthew. John mentions Jesus' mother's sister without naming her. Scholars today approach these identifications with caution. The differences between gospel accounts might reflect different sources or different moments in the same events. Women came and went from the scene. Some stood close to the cross. Others watched from a distance. Some came to the tomb on Sunday morning. Others had been present throughout the Passion. The variations don't necessarily indicate different people, but they don't prove the same identity either. More importantly, the silence about Jesus' sisters by name might have been deliberate rather than accidental. Women in antiquity often remained unnamed in texts unless they held unusual prominence or status. The sisters, as unmarried daughters or as married women integrated into their husbands' families, might not have warranted individual identification in accounts focused on Jesus' public ministry and passion. Their presence among the many other women mentioned in passing seems more likely than their identification with prominent figures like Salome or Mary of Clopas. Yet the attempts to identify them reveal something significant. They show how early Christians wrestled with family relationships and authority. They demonstrate the importance placed on kinship connections to Jesus. They expose tensions between different understandings of Jesus' family. In the Eastern Church, some traditions held that Joseph had been married before and brought children to his union with Mary. In this view, Jesus' brothers and sisters were older half-siblings. The Western Church, concerned with Mary's perpetual virginity, preferred to see them as cousins. The identification of Mary of Clopas as Jesus' aunt served this theological purpose while maintaining the reality of family members in the Gospels. Salome's possible connection to the family through her sister Mary would explain certain narrative details. It would clarify why she had the confidence to approach Jesus with a request for her sons. It would make sense of Jesus entrusting his mother to John at the cross, if John was not just a disciple, but a nephew. It would deepen the ties between Jesus' inner circle and his blood relatives. But these explanations remain speculative, built on possibilities rather than certainties. What remains clear is that women from Jesus' extended family circle played important roles in his ministry and in the early community. Whether the unnamed sisters can be identified with named women in the Gospels or remained anonymous, their existence points to a wider network of female relatives. Aunts, cousins, sisters-in-law, and kinswomen would have formed part of the social world Jesus inhabited. Some followed him, some supported the movement, some witnessed the crucial moments of his death and resurrection. Their stories interweave with those of other women disciples, creating a tapestry richer than any single gospel account reveals. The search for the sisters' identities continues. Each generation of scholars brings new methods and questions. Archaeological discoveries provide context for understanding family structures and naming patterns. Comparative studies of other Jewish families in the period shed light on household composition. Literary analysis reveals the ways ancient authors selected and shaped their material. Through all these approaches, the sisters remain elusive, glimpsed briefly in references to siblings, possibly hidden among the named women, certainly present in the social reality behind the texts. They remind us that history preserves some voices while silencing others. The named women in the Gospels carried their stories into later tradition. The unnamed ones disappeared into the collective category of sisters and many other women. Yet both groups lived through the same extraordinary events, encountered the same transformative teachings, and participated in the birth of a movement that would reshape the world. The Desposini, the sisters' legacy and lineage in the early church. Beyond the sisters themselves lies a wider family network. The early Christian communities knew them by a special term, the Desposini. The word comes from Greek, meaning those who belong to the Lord. It designated blood relatives of Jesus and their descendants. Brothers, sisters, cousins, nephews, and nieces who carried the family connection through generations. This network of kinship held special significance in the decades and centuries after Jesus' death. The prominence of Jesus' family began immediately. James, identified as the Lord's brother, emerged as a leader in Jerusalem. He did not number among the 12 apostles during Jesus' ministry. He appears to have been skeptical, along with other family members, while Jesus traveled and taught. Yet, after the resurrection, James believed. Paul mentions that the risen Christ appeared to James specifically. From that point forward, James took a central role in the Jerusalem community. By all accounts, James led the church in Jerusalem with considerable authority. When Peter departed the city after his miraculous escape from prison, James assumed primary leadership. When Paul visited Jerusalem to discuss his mission to non-Jewish peoples, he met with James, Peter, and John, described as pillars of the church. When the Jerusalem council gathered to debate whether Gentile converts needed to follow Jewish law, James spoke with decisive voice. His position carried weight. His judgment shaped the outcome. Why did James hold such authority? His relationship to Jesus certainly mattered. In a culture that valued kinship and lineage, having the Lord's brother as leader provided continuity and legitimacy. James could speak to Jesus' teachings from personal knowledge. He had grown up in the same household. He knew the family traditions. He understood the context of Jesus' formation. This familial connection gave his leadership a foundation that others could not claim. But James was not the only family member involved in the early movement. After James met his end, executed by the Sanhedrin around the year 62, another relative succeeded him. Simeon, son of Clopas, took leadership of the Jerusalem church. Early historians identify Clopas as Joseph's brother. This makes Simeon a cousin of Jesus. The choice of another family member as Bishop of Jerusalem reveals a pattern. Leadership in the mother church remained within the Desposini. Written records from the late 1st and early 2nd centuries mention these relatives with respect. One account tells of grandsons of Jude, identified as the Lord's brother. Roman authorities, concerned about potential political threats from descendants of David's line, brought these grandsons before the emperor. The interrogation sought to determine whether they posed danger to imperial rule. The farmers showed their calloused hands as evidence of their simple life. They explained that their kingdom was spiritual, not political. They were released and returned to their communities, where they provided leadership in the churches. This story illuminates several realities. First, Jesus' family members understood themselves as Davidic descendants. They could trace lineage back to Israel's ancient kings. Second, Roman authorities took this lineage seriously enough to investigate it. Third, these relatives held leadership positions in multiple Christian communities, not just Jerusalem. Fourth, their connection to Jesus granted them authority and respect among believers. The sources suggest that the pattern extended broadly. Villages in the region had churches led by desposini. Names traditional in Jesus' family appeared among these leaders: James, Joseph, Simon, Judas, Zechariah. They kept family names alive across generations. They maintained genealogical records. They preserved memory of their connection to the Lord. Where do the sisters fit in this network? The sources speak primarily of male relatives because patriarchal society tracked lineage through fathers and sons. Women married into other families. Their children took their father's name. Yet the sisters would have been part of this Desposini network. Their descendants, if they had children, would have shared in the family connection. Through maternal lines, the bloodline continued, even as names changed. Consider the possibilities. If one of Jesus' sisters married within the believing community, her children would have known their uncle was Jesus. They would have grown up hearing stories directly from family members. They would have had claims to authority based on kinship. If a sister married a man who later became a believer, her household might have formed an early center of the movement. If a sister remained in Nazareth or nearby, she would have been part of the web of relationships that sustained Jewish Christians in Galilee. The evidence suggests women participated actively in early Christian communities. Houses belonged to women who hosted gatherings. Women prophesied and prayed in assemblies. Women traveled as missionaries and co-workers with apostles. Women held roles as deacons and benefactors. Within this context, Jesus' sisters would have had natural authority. Their family connection would have mattered regardless of gender. Their memories of Jesus' childhood and family life would have been valuable. Their presence would have authenticated the human reality of the incarnation. Yet, as the church grew and changed, the prominence of the Desposini diminished. Several factors contributed to this shift. The destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70 scattered the community and disrupted its leadership structure. The increasing number of Gentile believers changed the church's composition and culture. Distance from Palestine meant distance from those who had known Jesus personally or could claim family connection. New forms of authority emerged based on apostolic succession, doctrinal orthodoxy, and institutional office rather than kinship. One tradition, preserved by a controversial source but reflecting authentic concerns, tells of a meeting in the 4th century. Desposini representatives traveled to Rome to meet with the bishop. They sought recognition of their traditional authority. They asked that bishops from the Desposini be appointed in key cities. They wanted the practice of supporting the Jerusalem church to continue. The Roman bishop, backed now by imperial power, refused. The era of family leadership had passed. The institutional church had taken a different path. This account, whether historically precise or not, captures a real transition. Early Christianity valued its Jewish roots and the family of Jesus. Later Christianity, increasingly Gentile and institutionalized, moved away from ethnic particularity and kinship authority. The Desposini, who had bridged Jewish tradition and new faith, who had carried the memory of Jesus in their very blood, found themselves marginalized. Their claims to special standing conflicted with emerging hierarchies based on different principles. The sisters and their descendants participated in this history, even if invisibly. They lived through the transformation of a small Jewish movement into a global religion. They experienced the shift from house churches to basilicas, from charismatic leadership to clerical orders, from Jerusalem as center to Rome as capital. Their great-great-grandchildren might have forgotten the exact connection, might have lost the genealogical records, might have been absorbed into the larger Christian population without distinction. Or perhaps some lines continued, preserving the memory even as official history moved on. Families passed down traditions. Villages remembered. Certain communities might have maintained awareness of their connection to the Holy Family long after the institutional church ceased to care. The evidence has not survived, but the possibility remains. Bloodlines continue even when names and records fade. What matters most is recognizing that Jesus came from a family. He had sisters who grew up alongside him. Those sisters likely had children. Those children knew they were related to the one whom believers called Lord. This web of kinship shaped the early movement in ways we can barely reconstruct. It provided leadership, continuity, and living memory. It connected the historical Jesus to the developing church. It made the incarnation concrete and particular, rooted in specific relationships and generations. The Desposini disappeared from prominence, but their legacy remained. Every time believers affirmed that Jesus was fully human, born of a woman, they implicitly acknowledged the family. Every time they traced his genealogy back through David to Abraham, they recognized kinship mattered. Every time they gathered as the household of faith, they echoed the early model of family-based community. The sisters and their descendants were part of this foundation, even when unnamed and unremembered. Reclaiming their memory. The sisters from antiquity to modern scholarship. For most of Christian history, Jesus' sisters existed only as a footnote. 2 brief gospel verses mention them, yet no names or stories follow. Early commentators noted their existence only to affirm that Jesus had siblings, or to reinterpret them away. Medieval art ignored them. Theology focused on named women like Mary Magdalene, not the unnamed daughters of Nazareth. As a result, the sisters slipped into centuries of near total obscurity. This silence is revealing. Historical memory depends on names, texts, liturgy, and devotion. Because the sisters lacked names, they gained no feast days. Without feast days, no shrines. Without shrines, no pilgrimage accounts or legends. Their absence in Scripture generated further absence in Christian imagination. Obscurity became self-perpetuating. Doctrinal debates deepened this erasure. Defenders of Mary's perpetual virginity needed alternative explanations for Jesus' brothers and sisters. Eastern tradition made them Joseph's children from a prior marriage. Western tradition, following Jerome, identified them as cousins. Whatever the solution, the result was the same. The sisters were pushed out of the immediate family and out of Christian consciousness entirely. Modern scholarship changed the landscape. Once historians shifted from defending doctrines to reconstructing first-century Jewish life, the sisters could no longer be ignored. The Gospels mention them explicitly. That demanded explanation. Archaeology provided context, how Galilean homes were built, how families functioned, how daughters were raised. Social history studies clarified marriage customs and household structure. Comparative evidence made it possible to move beyond theological debates toward historically grounded reconstruction. Feminist scholars pushed the conversation further. They highlighted how women's stories were routinely erased from historical records and developed methods for reading silences, gaps, and implied presences. Jesus' sisters became a case study, mentioned but unnamed, present but invisible, precisely the sort of figures women's history methods were designed to recover. Recent decades have produced a steady stream of scholarship. Articles and books examine the sisters directly, asking how they lived, how they would have understood Jesus' ministry, and what became of them after the resurrection. None of this produces biographies, only patterns, probabilities, and historically informed imagination. But the questions themselves mark a major shift from 2 millennia of indifference. Reconstruction is inevitably speculative. With no names, no stories, and no later traditions, scholars must rely on analogy. What was typical for young women in first-century Nazareth? How did Jewish families operate in rural Galilee? What options existed for daughters, widows, or married women in small villages? Such data creates a framework, not for certainty, but for credible understanding. Recovering the sisters serves several purposes. Historically, it balances the picture of Jesus' family. In women's history, it repairs part of a long-standing gap. For theological reflection, it grounds Jesus more firmly in the reality of a large, complex household. And for readers today, it offers biblical figures whose situation, overshadowed, unnamed, yet deeply involved, resonates across centuries. Their disappearance from tradition raises broader questions. How do we decide whose stories matter? Why were some women remembered while others vanished? How did doctrinal priorities shape history telling? These questions extend beyond Jesus' sisters to the entire process of how religious memory is crafted. Modern scholars face their own challenges. The push to restore women's presence can tempt overreach. Frustration with earlier neglect can lead to exaggeration. Responsible work requires balancing imagination with evidence, acknowledging uncertainty, while refusing to let silence erase real human lives. What can be said with confidence is simple. Jesus had sisters. At least 2, possibly more. They grew up in the same home, shared the same hardships, and lived within the same cultural and religious world. They almost certainly married, had children, and knew about their brother's ministry. They may have been present at key events. They may have joined early believers in Nazareth or maintained quiet faith within their households. Beyond this, we meet the limits of the sources. Yet even limited knowledge changes how we read the story. The home in Nazareth was not populated by a handful of iconic figures. It was a full family. The tensions surrounding Jesus involved daughters as well as sons. The early movement included women related to Jesus by blood, not only by discipleship. The incarnation becomes more deeply human when placed within a noisy, crowded household that included sisters whose lives shaped the same environment Jesus inhabited. Ultimately, the sisters stand in for every unnamed woman in Scripture and history. They remind us that behind every text lies more life than the text records. Their absence challenges us to imagine what was ordinary, hidden, and overlooked. They exist at the crossroads of faith and history, real women whose stories cannot be recovered, yet whose presence cannot be denied. The work of reclaiming them continues. New methods, new discoveries, and new questions bring their world into sharper focus, not to write biographies that cannot exist, but to acknowledge a larger truth. The story of Jesus unfolded within a real family, in a real culture, surrounded by real women whose contributions mattered, even if history failed to write down their names.